Gustav III, was a supporter of the American War of Independence against the British Empire, and in 1777 he became the first head of state in the world to recognize the United States as a country. Already in October of 1776, he said the following:
"It is such an interesting spectacle to see a state creating itself that, if I were not who I am, I would go to America to see at first hand all the stages of the creation of this new republic. This is perhaps America's century. The new republic, which has hardly a better composed population than Rome had to begin with, may one day exploit Europe, just as Europe has exploited America for 2 centuries. In any case, I can't help but admire their courage and love their boldness."
In 1792, he was assassinated. Following his murder, 20 years of turmoil ensued. But Sweden still remained a monarchy through the revised constitution of 1809, but now also partly as a nation ruled by the Freemasons, whose Grand Master was King Carl XIII. From a national perspective, the decision-making process was both informal and hidden, but the real power was exercised by the landowning nobility, together with the financial aristocracy. This was under the perhaps not always so brilliant Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who through the manipulation of the nobility was appointed de facto co-regent of King Carl XIII. On his arrival in Sweden in 1810, as Prince of Pontecorvo, his full name had been changed to Jean-Baptiste Jules, which in Swedish translated into Johann Baptist Julius, the form of name used in the order of succession. He was named after his adoptive father King Carl XIII, and later became the rightful heir to the throne following the death of the king in 1818. This meant the immediate installation of a police state-like control apparatus led by a military man, controlled by the nobility, as Sweden's new king, Carl XIV Johan. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, it was decided that Sweden would remain neutral in international conflicts. King Gustav III's support for the liberation of the North American colonies from the British Empire and its developing banking conglomerate was all too recent. Significantly, the Swedish representatives did not participate in the decision. They were only present as observers. The nation of Sweden was not independent, and the majority of the population lived unfree and poor in an agrarian feudal society with the church as the ideological whip. People in the countryside earned their living as contract workers, crofters and cottagers, or self-employed poor farmers. These feudal conditions provided a fertile ground for the content of the America letters. Over a period of 50 years, a third of the population emigrated to the United States. The America letters were part of the correspondence between American immigrants and their countries of origin, including Sweden. These letters were meant to encourage more human capital to come and colonize the United States. In this feudal darkness, Sweden paradoxically nurtured a scientific tradition with names like Linnaeus and Celsius in the 18th century, followed by Berzelius and Ångström and others. This contributed significantly to the fact that Sweden was, and to some extent still is, a country of scientists, engineers and inventors. The natural science tradition goes back to Christopher Polem's various industrial projects, including the Trollhätte Canal from the first half of the 18th century. 100 years later, the brothers John and Niels Ericsson became good stewards of that tradition. However, John Ericsson's rebellious nature made it difficult for him to breathe properly in the feudal society that Sweden still was. Perhaps we should not forget that it took almost 100 years after the formal dismantling of feudal society for the last remnants of the contract worker system to disappear in the 1940s. It was therefore in the United States that John Ericsson found the development climate he needed. Here, he made the contribution that gave him a decisive influence on history that few Swedes have achieved. His propeller-driven monitor ships broke the naval military dominance of the Confederacy over the Union, led by President Lincoln. The 1840s and the following decades marked a period of reform for Sweden. The estate's Riksdag was abolished in 1862, and in conjunction with this liberalization, the free-spirited finance minister Grippenstedt in the late 1850s pushed for a state railway system to be built at state expense, financed by loans mainly from France and Prussia. John Ericsson's brother Niels, who remained in Sweden, continued first as a canal builder, but even more important were his efforts to build a nationwide railway network. He became the first Director General of SJ, State Railways, in the 1870s. This infrastructure and transport technology created entirely new conditions for the real economic expansion of Swedish industry. In this climate of industrial development in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Swedish inventors flourished in the pro-American spirit of John Ericsson. This spirit would, of course, later be ridiculed by the Swedish film industry. In reality, the international ramifications were obvious, with links to countries such as the USA, Russia, and Germany. The link to Russia was primarily the Nobel family, which for 3 generations from 1840 to 1917 was one of the leading families in developing Russian industry. Best known is Alfred Nobel, whose development of the blasting cap laid the foundations for the entire modern explosives industry. His father, Emanuel Nobel, who left Sweden in 1837 after a bankruptcy and started a new career in Petersburg, invented several machine tools and also developed a system for heating residential buildings with hot water, according to principles that became widely adopted. In 1876, his son Louis, together with his 2 brothers, Alfred and Robert, founded a company in the petroleum industry with a distillation plant based in Baku. By the late 1880s, the Nobel brothers were technological leaders in the oil industry. Until 1917, the 3rd-generation Nobel, Ludwig's son Emanuel, actively contributed to technological development in Russia, including supporting the production of the diesel engine and motorized ships. Both Louis and Emanuel were very concerned about their close associates and employees. For example, Ludwig introduced a profit-sharing scheme for employees. Another well-known Swedish company in Petersburg during this period until 1917 was the telecommunications company LM Ericsson, founded by the inventor and designer Lars Magnus Ericsson, but now in the hands of the Wallenberg family. Let's just put it like this. Some people seem less prone to cooperation than others, and more interested in their own profits, no matter the cost. Other inventors, innovators, and entrepreneurs in this physical economic tradition, who founded several of the major Swedish companies that are still world leaders, are Gustav de Laval, Stahl Laval, Gustav Dalén, AGA, and Sven Winkvist, SKF, and Volvo. It was in this climate of engineering and industrial development that the brothers Ivar and Torsten Kruger were formed. The Kruger family were leading entrepreneurs in the timber and match industry in Kalmar and Mönsterås. His father, Ernst Kruger, was a respected business leader and Russian vice-consul in Kalmar from 1895 to 1917. Ivar Kruger had a cellulose and construction company in Petersburg until 1917. We can see interesting personal connections during the period from 1850 to 1917, mainly between Alfred Nobel and John Ericsson. The two met during Alfred's 2-year stay in the United States in the 1850s, which is logical given that both were involved in marine weapons technology. John Ericsson conspired with Abraham Lincoln to build a Russian fleet on the Monitor principle in Petersburg. Russia, under Tsar Alexander II, had actually supported the North in the American Civil War, a fact that many people are unaware of. Both father Ernst Kruger and son Ivar Kruger were involved in the same Petersburg network as Alfred and Emanuel Nobel, Ernst from 1895 to 1917 and Ivar in 1910 to 1917. As we described in the introduction, after 1809 Sweden was under police state-like control by a landowning nobility in alliance with a financial aristocracy. As censorship and control were challenged and loosened in the first half of the 19th century, and the general development impulses broke through in the form of increased information mobility, a market-based economy emerged. In the mid-19th century, the need for a modern banking system became apparent. In 1856, the ship-owner and politician André Oskar Wallenberg founded Stockholm's Enskilda Bank, SEB. He became the founder of a financial dynasty, now in its sixth generation, which fulfills all the functions required of a Synoky elite. Many of the daughters of André Oskar's 22 children were therefore deliberately married into the nobility. André Oskar Wallenberg was what we would describe today as a networker of the highest order. And as history would come to show, moral fiber was not something that came in high regard. It was always profit over life. He gained social recognition by holding large parties with diplomats, members of parliament, scientists, wealthy people, etc. The parties became forums for information and gossip, which were all then carefully recorded. At the end of André Oskar's life, the financing of domestic railways and industrial companies was abandoned. Instead, SEB focused on trading in bills of exchange and brokering government bonds to France and Germany. In 1887, after much stock speculation, SEB became insolvent, at which point King Oscar II announced that he had put money into the bank, and confidence was then restored. After this, it is not surprising that the Wallenberg sphere and its bank are perceived as the bookkeepers of the nobility, with the ideological emphasis on printing only the street name in the bank's address, not the number. Because, after all of the subjects know where the emperor lives. In Sweden's economic history, two main orientations emerge. One is made up of networks and individuals whose main concern in life is to ensure the continued power of the financial aristocracy and an increasingly emerging contractual elite. It was from this orientation that a synarchist order emerged starting in the second half of the 19th century, with the Wallenberg sphere establishing itself as the Swedish financial power center. It is precisely the Wallenberg sphere that has to date been the main representative of the international synarchist order. The second approach is supported by those entrepreneurs, scientists, engineers, and inventors who have been driven by a general view of development that says that everyone should reap the benefits of progress and innovation, not just an arrogant governing elite. Ivar Kruger was in this sense the major titan of Swedish entrepreneurship from 1910 until his eventual demise in 1932. During this period, Kruger showed that he had a superior understanding of crises and the credit mechanisms that needed to be created. The very existence of the already established national and international financial interests was threatened by Kruger's progress. In Sweden, it was the Wallenberg sphere and its partner, Bonnier. And in the United States, it was the banking and financial grouping around the Morgan family. That was Kruger's most important opponent. The Morgans and the Wallenberg family was in this sense accomplices. André Oskar Wallenberg's two sons, Knut, foreign minister in Hammarskjöld's government 1914 to 1917, and Marcus, known as Heradshovdingen, loosely translated to the Chief Justice, and was SEB's CEO from 1911 to 1920, were, in the spirit of their father, industrious and influential networking figures both in Sweden and internationally. The brothers' approach to banking and finance was entirely consistent with the sterling and pound-based gold standard that had been in force since 1870. This was a kind of treasury economy in which the creditworthiness and wealth of countries was measured in terms of the amount of gold in the foreign exchange reserves, a measure that says nothing about either the actual tangible livelihood of the population or the state of the real economy. Conceptually, the gold standard is a precursor to monetarism and EMU's nominalist criteria for monetary and credit policy. At the same time as the Wallenbergs pressed on with their influence, today's party system began to take shape at the end of the 19th century as international demands for democracy spread to Sweden, all according to the principle of one man, one vote. It ended 50 years later with the introduction of political democracy and with the parliamentary democracy in the 1920s and 30s. Its real objective, however, just like in the UK, was to ensure the survival of the financial aristocracy. The new political power structure that emerged in the wake of international industrialism was a militant working class. In Sweden, it took refuge in a reformist, popular movement-based social democracy. Together with the liberals, this was the driving force behind the introduction of universal suffrage and later the bluff of parliamentarism. In the government of 1917 to 1920, which included the Social Democrats, Knut Wallenberg was succeeded as foreign minister by his brother Marcus's good friend Johannes Hellner, an arrangement that gave Hellner a seat on the board of SEB. History is silent about Johannes Hellner's actions, and many people are still awaiting some answers. In 1914 to 1920, Marcus Chief Justice Wallenberg was hired by the government for various foreign assignments, and in reality, this continued well into the 1930s. He took part in the Versailles negotiations to safeguard Swedish interests in financial matters. He took part in talks on the neutral country's claims on Germany. In 1924, he chaired the two committees which, under the Dawes Plan, were to ensure that Germany paid its war reparations under the Versailles Treaty, which was the death knell of the gold standard system. In conflicts between the German government and the War Reparations Committee, Marcus Wallenberg was the sole arbitrator. In 1930, he became chairman of the organizing committee of the Young Plan and a member of its arbitration court. In 1931, he was appointed president of the arbitration court dealing with disputes over Germany's short-term credits. In 1932, he was appointed as one of two people to reform the German banking system. In other words, he was in the thick of things when it came to counteracting the German political and industrial forces that were working feverishly to try to stop the Nazis by eliminating the basis of Hitler's propaganda of discontent, which mainly consisted of the forces around Wilhelm Lautenbach in the German government and around Vladimir Wojtyński in the German Trade Union Federation that worked with Ivar Kruger. The world today is in a situation similar to that of the early 1930s. Economic austerity is pushing the US and Europe in the same direction as then, into fascism, war and dictatorship. The economic methods of the American system, used in 1927 to 1933 by Ivar Kruger and his allies in the US, France, Germany, Sweden and other countries, could have stopped the Hitler project in its tracks, and by extension, the Second World War. The same American economic system was then used by F.D. Roosevelt to mobilize the necessary resources to save the world from a fascist financial world dictatorship. But it also had been used by others to fund it in the first place.